I am Helen Wright, Senior Impact Manager at the Dickson Poon School of Law, King's College London. Welcome to Research in Action, our new podcast bringing you research from the Dickson Poon School of Law community, which is shaping law, policy and society. Hear conversations with leading experts from King's College London and beyond, as they reveal how their work impacts the world. Our academics aren't just working to address today's most pressing legal challenges, they are driving the debate. In this episode, we are exploring the Wellcome Discovery funded project Between Deception and Dissent, regulating unproven, disproven and misleading health-related claims. I have with me Professor Emilie Cloatre from King's and Professor Martyn Pickersgill from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, thank you for doing this. Maybe we could start off with you introducing yourselves and giving a little background.
Hi, I'm Professor Emilie Cloatre. I'm a professor of medical law at King's College London. My background is across law or socio-legal studies, rather, and science and technology studies. And I've been researching for years various topics at the crossroad of looking at the relationship between health and medicine in different contexts, and health in medical knowledge in particular. So the project builds on those years of research.
Martyn?
So as you kindly mentioned, I'm a professor of the Sociology of Science and Medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where I co-lead the Centre for Biomedicine, Self and Society. My first training is actually biology before I kind of defected to the social sciences for an MA and PhD, which is where I had the good fortune of meeting Emilie. So we've known each other a very long time now. I won't say how long because it will clearly age us, but it's more than a while. And most of my work's been around the social dimensions of biomedicine writ large, including how areas of contestation and are kind of socially negotiated, and how kind of areas that are often seen as true with a capital T are kind of navigated and in turn contested.
Well, thank you. I know the project a little. I've been incredibly impressed by the complexity and the expansiveness and the ambition of what you're doing. How did it come about?
Myself and Martyn and the other co-Is have all been in conversation for many years on related topics. So from my part, I worked before this project. I was leading a Wellcome Investigator Award looking at the regulation of alternative and traditional medicine. So starting from these questions of how states respond to how states regulate practices that don't fall neatly within medical paradigm, within biomedical paradigms. So of course, once you start looking at those kind of fringe practices, then questions come up about how do we even know which ones are legitimate, which ones are valid, etc. So I already had this interest for years in knowledges and claims that are considered as fringe or contested, let's say. And then, of course, we also, this was going on during COVID. So in the time of COVID, I think we all started to see all these different types of claims, of unproven claims, of misinformation coming up. But for me, what was interesting is that whereas a lot of the topics I was researching and looking at aspects of alternative and traditional medicine were not very high on the political agenda. It was a sort of, fairly niche topic. All of a sudden, with COVID, misinformation became a thing everyone was talking about. So all of a sudden, in this kind of moment of emergency that we had of global crisis, all of a sudden, the discourse shifted, in my view, in a way that assumed we had to do something about health misinformation, which I don't disagree with, but also that it should be straightforward to identify what misinformation is, what health misinformation is. And that wasn't my experience from looking at plenty of different practices, which around the world were considered quite differently, maybe considered as valid in some state contexts, in some regulatory contexts, might be considered as unproven, problematic, etc. in others, which over time as well as over space were again considered as legitimate or not. So the question of, how do states actually decide when unproven claims matter and what we should do about them and when they're a problem became a thing that, I talked about with Martyn, I talked about with the other co-Is during that period of crisis. And that was the kind of start of the discussion.
Is it just that this discourse increased and people were more aware of misinformation during that period, or was there an increase in misinformation as a result of that period? So is it that it became more recognisable, that people were more aware of it, or was there an uptake in those sort of health-related claims?
I think a bit of both, and I think it's quite hard to tell in quantitative terms, partly because a lot of those claims, and we've all grown up with them, we've all seen, lifestyle magazines advertising all kind of stuff for years, like those kind of problematic claims, let's say, are everywhere all the time, and it's so spread out in a way that it's very hard to have a sense, at any moment of how much of it there is. Of course, the other sort of historical shift more recently has been across social media and the sort of high visibility of claims and fast circulation of claims during this same period of time. So, people talk about infodemics during COVID because all of a sudden there were tons of information and tons of claims circulating everywhere. But those were also easy to see because they were online, they were on social media, etc. So my view on, is there more of it than before? I'm very cautious with that because I think we see it more, we recognize it more, we talk about it more, but I don't know. Martyn, you might have a different view.
I don't have a different view, Emilie, which is bodes well for the rest of the project. One of the things that's interesting to us in this project is the non-spectacular as well as the kind of, or the mundane, rather, I should say, as well as the spectacular. So there's obviously the challenges of misinformation around miracle cures around COVID and stuff. So that's clearly a source of interest for us. But there's also, more taken for granted forms of what might these days be called misinformation, but if you're wanting to kind of use those sorts of terms, they're sort of seen as fine. So an example, like a really everyday example might be telling you, oh, you've got a cold, you need to take vitamin C. Vitamin C cures a cold. Or you've got a cold, you need to wrap up warm, right? So these are really everyday things. At what point then do things sort of tip over into something that's a concern? So what is that kind of tipping point, and how is that enacted differently in different countries, but also in terms of different sorts of forms of mental and ill health? The other thing I think we're kind of interested in here, and which often really sort of evades attention actually, is when biomedicine itself kind of might be propagating claims that are kind of contested in some ways. So these would very rarely be attributed or characterized as misinformation, but it might be, for instance, researchers or medics making claims over social media that kind of exceed their sphere of expertise, for instance, but they're still kind of deemed sort of okay, if you like, because of, I don't know, maybe academic freedom of speech or well, I'm not giving you a formal medical opinion or that kind of thing. So how these sorts of caveats and sort of taken for granted get out of jail free cards, if you like, kind of operate as well are really interesting to us.
Which countries are you looking across? So what's the project spanning?
So the project is spanning case studies in Europe, in West Africa, and in North America. So in Europe, we're looking at the UK, Ireland, France, and Greece. In West Africa, we're looking at Senegal and Ghana, and then we're looking at Canada and Mexico in the North American context. So each of those countries, very different debates are taking place, basically.
And how did you decide?
So those were a mixture of where we were all already working. So each of our, we have co-Is who are basically experienced in each of those places or based in each of those countries. And also countries where we knew enough to see that the sort of discourse were raising slightly different questions. So, in Europe, for example, France and Greece had very forceful and state-centered and criminal law-centered responses during COVID to contested claims. And that builds on a longer history of quite, we make laws in France and we use police powers to stop things. It's very centralized and quite top down. So it's a particular tradition to regulating. States where the biomedical professions are very influential within the state as well. So a particular relation between law and medicine. Whereas in the UK and Ireland, you have this more common law oriented tradition, or you have common law traditions where the state regulates more. Let's say you have a slightly more hands-off way of approaching those kind of questions. So, the regulation of healing professions, for example, looks very different in the UK or in France. In Ghana and Senegal, again, you have different legal heritage from the sort of colonial past of both countries. So you have this same tension between a civil law system or a system inspired by French regulation and French legal systems in Senegal, and then a more common law-based history in Ghana and a different colonial history. But you also have very different debates, both because access to biomedicine is different. So, limiting alternative claims and different types of knowledges doesn't necessarily make sense in the same way. But also there's very long traditions of traditional healing being used, which again rest on different kind of truths, different types of legitimacy, different types of ontologies, which means that this question of how do you regulate health misinformation needs to take into account the fact that there's different forms of truth. And then in Canada and Mexico, again, some of these similar tensions come up, but we're also looking at states that have a federal structure, which means that the kind of differences and distinctions take place within different states in Canada with different traditions, let's say. So, or between the sort of federal level and the local levels of lawmaking, but also the indigenous question complicates, again, a bit like in West Africa. If you're going to allow and recognize that traditions have value, then how do you take those into account, or recognizing indigenous rights, etc. So all this kind of specific features in each countries complicate the debates. And we're not looking to necessarily directly compare them across, because we really want to take them as different spaces.
Are there any similarities? Because there's lots of differences there, but are there any things that are consistently found across those different countries, do you think, or is that part of what you're looking to find out?
I think at the moment, the main thing that is consistent is that in all those countries, there is a desire to regulate better.
What types of sources of misinformation do you look at? Is it broad? Are they more prevalent? Some more prevalent in one country than another? Are some more problematic than others?
Because health misinformation can be taken almost everywhere in any direction, we agreed on 5 broad themes that are running through the project and that we'll be using to find specific examples we want to dig into, specific debates we want to dig into. Reproductive health, mental health, faith-based and miracle cures. And then we want to look at some of the more emergency-based responses and legal interventions. So, in COVID, for example, we've seen some very quick reactions to misinformation when there is an emergency, where the sort of balance between freedom of speech and public health necessity takes a different shape. And finally, the last trend we want to look at is around wellness and those spaces that are around healthy living, wellness, not necessarily seen as health claims and therefore not necessarily regulated quite as tightly, but proliferating in a way that is worrying states a little bit.
It's who makes the decisions, and also why do they make those decisions? So that's part of what you're looking at.
Exactly.
But who decides currently?
So the truth is there's a lot we don't know yet, and we, not just us as a team, but collectively in terms of who decides and when it matters. So you have the sort of obvious instances of state-based regulators or state regulators that are going to decide, for example, on the approval of medicines, what a medicine can claim to be for or to be useful for, what other types of products, food supplements, etc. So you have state regulators, but you also have social media platforms that, to whom some of this power of drawing the line of what is an okay claim and what content needs to be taken down is delegated. And then you have, in some cases, church-based institutions that decide what is, who is a real healing priest, for example, and who is a fraud. Or you will, so you have this different level there of quite formal, recognizable institutions that will decide. But then you also have all the sort of softer spaces of regulation. So we've seen debunking websites popping up during COVID, where health claims were being debunked and the truth was being exposed. So again, those managing those kind of platforms are making decisions that will influence people. So you could almost see it as a form of informal regulation. Healers themselves may decide. So alternative healers, for example, are often, or traditional healers are often organized in communities, professional associations. And within that, they may have mechanisms to decide when a particular healer is claiming something that is untrue or that is problematic, and decide to take action or to just speak out against what they're saying. So, who decides is a really big question. It seems straightforward, but actually it's a really, really big question because those claims are in so many different places.
What responsibility do tech platforms and social media have for this, and how do they operationalize it? Martyn, maybe?
So I'm not a philosopher, so I don't tend to come down on the sort of how much responsibility do they or do they not kind of get. I'm much more interested in how that responsibility gets enacted and who thinks it should be enacted and why. So in what kind of situations do governments or of kind of regulators that are devolved from governments kind of go, oh, this isn't our responsibility, this is social media's responsibility, or others that go, okay, no, we need to pass some hard law here that exerts control over these kind of social media organizations. And then which sorts of social media organizations as well? So are we talking like X and Facebook, or are we also talking about things like Blue Sky and even Mastodon, if anyone is still kind of using that particular platform, LinkedIn as well, right? So the space here is textured and complex, and I think the kinds of empirical socio-legal work that we'll be kind of doing are less orientated towards the more standard kind of philosophical or kind of traditionally sort of legal questions of who should do X, Y or Z, and whose responsibility is it, but like it's much more trying to understand the kind of the social theory of it all and what this tells us about society, and using those insights then actually to engage with our colleagues who are doing the more kind of traditional forms of kind of law and philosophy there, and go, actually maybe this contextual kind of understanding and knowledge and theorization can actually support the normative kind of routes that you're kind of going down.
Are there any examples of ways in which that you think the regulation got it right, or are there any good examples that you can point to that are currently out there?
Legal enforcement is never straightforward in any kind of way. Laws don't have the same impact on everyone. So, it may be that a particular intervention is really successful in one way, but is problematic in another one. So anything really good that's been happening, or, anything really problematic, we might get a sense of something that looks interesting, unusual, or whatever as it comes up. But to make sense of how useful it is, that takes time. And this is why, this is a 6-year project, and we need to look through that.
As I was looking through the project and I was doing my background, one of the things that really struck me, I've spent a long time supporting creative practice research, and one thing that really stood out to me in looking at the documentation I had was the embeddedness of creativity within. I think I counted 36 mentions of creative in the actual bid document, and I'm really interested in that and why you thought it was important and what those creative methodologies and outcomes might look like.
So I think to us it's useful in two ways, and again this is based on more on our previous experience than on what we know already of this particular, in the context of this particular project. One is that health practice is unequal, complicated, messy, and that bringing out different experiences and different perspectives is quite hard. So we have sociological methods, socio-legal methods to try to get to some of that, but creative practices have also got a long history of making certain things and certain experiences visible. And we think this is really important in a project, in the context of debates where quite often lived experience is more complicated than the sort of policy take on a particular phenomenon, let's say. So one element of it is understanding and making things visible. And the second element is being more imaginative in relation to what regulation can look like and what law actually is. So this goes back to your question of who decides. Well, some actors at the moment are deciding officially or unofficially. Once we understand exactly how this works and what the impact is on different groups of people, because again, we know that the law is unequal in its effects. Once we know this, can we imagine different ways in which things could be reorganized and in which the law could make things look different? And could this be different in different contexts as well? Because again, we want to work with this diversity, and the fact that for a long time legal imagination has been very West-centered, and there's plenty of other ways we could be ordering or organizing life. So that's the two purposes of creative strategies.
Engagement's really core to this work, isn't it? It comes throughout it. I mean, why? Can you explain? And you talk about engagement with communities, and I was interested in the range of those communities and how you'll be engaging with them.
So, one way is simply ongoing kind of consultative dialogue with kind of affected communities, and that includes kind of practitioners themselves. So these can be kind of informal, ad hoc kind of engagements that are kind of built through long-term collaborations with patient organizations or with kind of professional associations, to sort of make sure that our kind of work doesn't lose sight of those kinds of lived experiences, and also that is kind of receptive to the concerns that they have, and that our case studies aren't just kind of being kind of shaped and informed and packaged up by dominant voices from kind of politics or the media, for instance, that we're actually looking at. Well, actually, this particular kind of patient group, for instance, is saying that, they're encountering lots of issues with X, Y, or Z, and lots of people are coming to the kind of sessions going, I've read about this. Is this a good therapy? Should I stop my meds and do this? That, and thinking, well, actually, is that the kind of thing we can kind of look at a bit more kind of closely.
On the website, there's the makings of a living archive, and I wonder what the vision for that was moving forwards. What might it look like?
The idea of the living archive is to have a space, an online space, where slowly we can put some curated elements of our findings. So little bits of data, which may be textual, but which may also be, podcast, for example, or which may be photography, or which may be based on our collaborations with creative artists. So spaces where somebody would want to get a little snapshot of what those debates are looking like in France or in Ghana or in Senegal or somewhere else, may get just a little bit of a sense.
Going back to actually something that Martyn said, I was wondering about, but are there particular patient groups that are more heavily targeted than others, or are more affected? Martyn?
I mean, I do think diseases associated with kind of progressive neurological illness are often one where there's a lot of suspicions in terms, and sort of I always loathe to talk about snake oil salespeople, but there can be, right? Selling products that are kind of underpinned by kind of like slightly kind of dodgy claims, but in a kind of a less impactful but more pervasive kind of perspective, in terms of what we might think of as mild to moderate forms of mental illness. I would say this is a huge kind of target or a huge kind of area where we can see a lot of contested claims circulating about, what's good for your brain and what's good for your well-being, and you should, salt lamps or this, that, and the other, are all sorts of different kind of products on the market that are kind of propagated to kind of help people. And they might, and this is part of the complexity and what makes this so kind of interesting, is that actually some of these areas where there are contested claims, particularly for forms of psychological ill health that don't kind of trip over into kind of clear psychiatric distress, then actually maybe those things are helpful. Like, if you're someone who buys a salt lamp and you say you find it helpful, maybe it's helpful. So then that queries where that contestation lies and where the kind of the epistemic warrant for it comes from. So you may have a bunch of professors of psychiatry going, well, of course they don't work, or but then if you've got a bunch of people who've had them going, they work, where does the space of contestation kind of have its sort of most acute kind of effects, and is this then something that needs to be kind of regulated?
Part of this is looking at what's harmful and what isn't, what's just like, salt lamps. So those groups that would seem to me that's quite an important question, because people, depending on the severity of the engagement and what people are taking away from it, I think is quite interesting actually, because they're the groups, those people that are most impacted by it are the groups that are going to get more benefit from having some of these issues unpicked.
I was just going to sort of add a footnote to that. I mean, to an extent, what our project is kind of looking at, again, to sort of underscore how we're maybe doing something a wee bit different to some of the other sorts of developing and unfolding sort of work around misinformation, is that what kind of is seen to constitute a harm, and who judges that. That's part of our analytic process, right? We're less concerned with saying ourselves, oh, X, Y, or Z is harmful and this is the action that needs to be taken, but we're interested in who says it's harmful, and how and why and in what ways is it harmful, because the harms may ramify in different ways. They may be direct physical harms, or they may be psychosocial harms, they may be kind of more environmental harms. And so again, like how harm is itself problematized is really, really central to this project.
And I was going to talk about the interdisciplinary, because it's marvelously expansive and interdisciplinary. What does this enable you to do that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise?
So I think it enables us to think carefully about all those different aspects, from the kind of, what is harm, for example, to what is knowledge, what is considered as legitimate, to how does law work? So how do we make law? How do we get to understand what the effects of particular regulations are? Our different perspectives enable us to sort of layer that, and the sort of range of resources and ideas we can build upon. I would add also that although the team is very interdisciplinary in some ways, we're also quite consistent in the conceptual approaches we come from. So we all come influenced by science and technology studies to some extent. So we come influenced by this idea that it's possible to unpick and try to make sense of how knowledge is constructed, and what is deemed reliable, what is deemed factual, is actually often more complicated than that. And that therefore, when law is going to draw lines to decide that, this is the kind of expert knowledge that is solid, definite, valid, and when it's going to dismiss certain things as not, often there's more stuff going on. It's not just a matter of getting facts and then applying them to making rules. That's one element where I think we all have the same concern. And the second one is that I think we all come to this as well with an awareness of the sort of imbalance in how people benefit from health systems and how people benefit from legal systems in different ways. And, medicine is not necessarily just, law is not necessarily just. And actually, this is really important for some of the questions we're looking at. We know that social groups that are less well served by biomedicine may be either targeted or embrace a little bit more knowledges that come from different traditions. So women, for example, may be more targeted by forms of health misinformation, or more attracted to alternative ways of doing health, for better or worse. So, you might want to protect women and create rules that take that into consideration. But we know as well that the law is not always very just and very fair to women. So this also matters in terms of thinking about where the solution may be and what regulation might do. So yes, we're very interdisciplinary, but we also have quite a lot in common in coming to those questions, from a mixture of perspectives that recognize these two very important elements, in my view, of how we think about the project.
And in terms of an academic contribution, what would you hope will be the outcomes of this at the end? And in terms of a social contribution, in terms of law or public health or discourse and debate, how do you envisage, what's your big picture?
So I can start on the first if you want, and then Martyn will let you do the second half of the question. So in terms of the academic contribution, I mean, there's many. So one element of it is just finding the answers to all those, including to all those very interesting questions you asked us, and that we just don't have because nobody has done this research. So, how do states regulate particular types of claims? Why do they focus on particular forms of claims at a particular moment? At one level, it's substantive impact, academic impact of putting all these stories and all this information on the table to trigger new types of conversations that move a little bit beyond we need to regulate health misinformation. Let's find ways to do this, to actually just take a step back and look and make sense of what's already going on and why it's probably a lot more complicated than just this. And then we're also hoping that the project is an opportunity to trigger more global conversations of how law and medical knowledge intersect with one another, because even though we are very interdisciplinary and want to have these interdisciplinary conversations, there's still lots of ways. It's still quite difficult to let me rephrase this. It's still quite a small number of people, of academics around the world who look at those questions of the interface between law, health, society, and we'd like that to grow. And we'd like that to grow in particular because in our experience, there's not a lot of interdisciplinary work done on law and medicine in general. And where this work is done, and there are pockets of very good critical interdisciplinary work that has started to take place. But when it's done, it tends to be in very limited parts of the world. So there's very little work that looks at the interface of law, health and society in Africa, for example. And we'd like those conversations to take place, not only because we think they're important substantively, but also because we think different people have to have a voice in what law is and how it works. And at the moment, we all think we know the answer to, what is law. Actually, the more insights you get from other places and other groups and communities, the more these ideas appear to be limited. So yeah, I think for us, it's both substantive impacts, but then also creating new networks, new conversations, and actually, recognizing as a global communities that we need to spend time thinking about how law and medical knowledge and society bounce against each other.
From a societal perspective?
For me, and I think for all of us really involved in the project, one of the key things as well is to help maybe shift things away from a strictly misinformation, disinformation kind of framing. So it's almost become, that's seen as the way of dealing with contestation right now, that the labels that we use are disinformation, misinformation, and that we can clearly identify what things are or are not, and therefore, we can act on that. And I think what we already know from our prior work is that actually there are also these forms of contestation that just don't quite fit into that. And then how do we deal with that? And how does a kind of a public health framing or a policy framing around regulation, for instance, in terms of misinformation, what does it end up missing out by doing that? And what does it end up actually advancing that's maybe not ideal as well? So part of our normative impulse, I guess, in that respect is, I think of it as being orthogonal to policy, right? So we're not directly trying to necessarily shape policy against current framings of what policy trajectories might be in terms of misinformation, but we kind of stand alongside and go, yes, but. So we might find, for instance, that a kind of a strategy for misinformation, actually what ends up doing is reinforcing a certain scientism, and then that silences a whole load of lived experience. And as we know for the cases of like long COVID, for instance, we know actually that a huge amount of kind of patient advocacy is what was involved in establishing the epistemological warrant for that to become kind of a legitimate sort of focus of biomedical concern. A kind of a scientific kind of approach to health policy would preclude those possibilities. So that's the sort of thing we kind of want to be mindful of and be kind of critical friends, I guess, of people who are kind of developing policy and practice in the kind of zone of misinformation specifically, but contributing a sort of a slightly different take on that.
How do regulators balance this free speech against, so people's right to say whatever they want to say, against claims that are problematic or maybe harmful?
Maybe we'll answer this in relation to freedoms more generally than just free speech, because it's also about, letting people have a choice about what kind of medical treatment they may want, letting people tell stories about their own experience or whatever. But there is this question, which is always there, of, how far do we tighten things up and how much do we limit the right for individuals, for companies, for people to experiment, to say things that are not proven. And in regulatory terms, you can almost imagine the sort of space of health and medicine as one where already there's plenty of rules that organize what can be said or what. Simply what can be said in a box of pills, for example, is very carefully regulated. So it's not so much, the question of free speech is one, but we already work in a system where there are limitations to what you can say. As we imagine where we may place further restrictions on what influencers can say online, how people can share their experiences publicly, etc. We don't just have a very particular set of examples that are easy to see, maybe as health misinformation, but also think that whatever rules you make is going to have much broader impact. So yes, it may seem like a good idea in some cases when you see, some of the content on TikTok, for example, to shut down what people who are not qualified medical practitioners or not qualified, in one way or another should be allowed to. But if you think as well that we live in a context where a lot of people have access to no mental health support at all, don't have access necessarily to reproductive health advice, where patients need to share experiences, and long COVID again is the best example of that, and where there are benefits to that. That rule you took with the idea of health misinformation in the first place is going to impact plenty of different practices that are not maybe quite what you had in mind when you created the law, but actually are also relevant. And at this stage, even just bringing out this kind of much more fluid space and what different forms of regulation means for all types of unproven claims, and not just the most obvious one, is quite an important question, and I think gets to the core of how do you balance freedoms and free speech or other things with the need to protect public health.
So that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for doing this. It was brilliant. I'm very glad you've been able to join us today. I'd like to thank you both for sharing your insights. If anybody listening would like to find out more, there is a project website. I won't, but I'm sure it will be linked to whatever communication is accompanying this. So I won't read out the www. And just to thank everybody for listening. Thank you very much, and goodbye.